The cell door banged open. Two armed men stepped in with a lamp that cut the darkness, and a child was dragged forward by the wrist. The woman on the pallet woke with a scream trapped in her throat. The pallet held a thin, rotting mattress. The floor smelled of urine and mold. She pushed herself up despite the pain in her limbs. They did not come to kill her yet. They came to take what she could not bear to lose. She clawed at the nearest guard. He shoved her back, rough hands on her shoulders, the smell of his breath and tobacco in her face. She shouted for them to stop and for the boy to be left alone. The child reached for her and called Mama in a voice too small for the room. The guards laughed and tightened the rope. The lamp revealed a face gone hollow, hair white at the roots, cheeks sunken, eyes rimmed with crimson. There was no privacy. Two guards watched from behind a screen. Their orders were simple. Observe, report, deny. They moved the boy out into the corridor, and with every step, his cries became smaller. The woman slumped back on the mattress and let the sound of the key in the lock be the last thing she heard in that cell. This scene had been repeated in different forms across prisons, but this was not a generic detainee. The woman had been queen. Her name and title had once made men bow, and governments rearranged themselves. Now she existed as a body to be inspected, as rumor and as example. To understand the enormity of what she endured, one must follow the narrowing path that brought her from gilded halls into those damp stones. She had been born an archduchess in an imperial house, married by arrangement, and later thrust into the French court as consort to a king who lacked will and carried the crown like a burden. Versailles was a world of protocol and performance. It had shaped her gestures, her speech, even her habits. She had been accused of extravagance and indifference, and those accusations fed a transformed French language that equated her name with excess. But the charges leveled against her when she became a prisoner were not only about spending. They included treason, correspondence with foreign courts, and finally the most vicious accusation that could be imagined, crimes against her own children. The record of what followed is plain, and the plainness is part of its horror. Deprivation, isolation, staged humiliations, and sustained attempts to break a person into pieces that a crowd could recognize and punish. After the royal household fell into the hands of revolutionaries, the family was moved under guard to a building that had once been a fortress. The Tuileries, the palace, the salons, all became part of the public record of loss. Guards who months earlier had taken orders now took revenge. The queen watched the palace emptied of its servants. The rooms that had meant protocol and image converted into evidence. Her children did not understand how the world had narrowed. The eldest daughter tried to keep a schedule to read and embroider. The youngest, barely a child, clung to the routine that had kept him from panic. For a time, the family remained together in the cramped quarters. There was dignity in the small domestic acts, a lesson read aloud, a needle passing through fabric, a shared piece of bread. Those moments did not reverse public momentum. The machinery of revolution required visible victories, and private grief meant little. When the king was carried away from the public square to his place of execution, the sentence registered on the queen as a wound that would not close. She was not present for the killing. She listened to the sound, a noise that would be repeated in histories as the death knell of monarchy. From that moment, she became untethered from any role that might protect her. She was no longer an equal actor in politics. She was evidence in a new narrative of popular justice. The months that followed were marked by a steady institutional narrowing of the Queen's world. The family was transported from one holding place to another. The prison known as the Temple offered rooms that tried to hold the remnants of the royal household together, but custody under revolutionary watch was custody without kindness. Sentries replaced footmen. Meal schedules replaced banquets. Supervision became surveillance. Small cruelties accumulated. The Queen, once used to silk and perfumes, found herself rationing bread and tearing at a wound in her side without medicine. Her hair began to lose pigment as stress and malnutrition took hold. She wrote letters to friends and foreign relatives that were intercepted. Every line could be read as correspondence with enemies. Her children, exposed to the whims of those in power, suffered not only lack of comforts but explicit instruction meant to discredit their lineage. The revolutionary government, eager to display its power, treated them as objects whose public humiliation would validate the regime. The Queen tried to shield her children from horror, but the state moved with a logic that treated family as a political target rather than a private bond. In those constrained rooms, the old hierarchies had been upended, but a new order of arbitrary cruelty had been installed. Isolation intensified as the calendar turned. Prisons across the city filled with those labeled enemies, and the procedures hardened. The Queen heard of laws passed to expedite trials to make the removal of suspected counter-revolutionaries a public task. She and her surviving family were increasingly excluded from the small mercies that had been available early on: visits from sympathetic acquaintances, small comforts from old retainers, petitions that might otherwise slip through official review. Instead, they experienced the blunt instrument of state control. Guards were instructed to record every word and to report even the faintest deviation from expected behavior. The Queen's body registered these pressures: swelling from a lack of proper food, infections from wounds left untreated, and unmanageable menstrual bleeding that went without medical care. The humiliation in these conditions was deliberate. The prison authorities understood the symbolic power in displaying a fallen sovereign in a state that reduced her to the base necessities of life. Outside, pamphlets and cartoons circulated that depicted her as a decadent monster. Inside, men with simple authority reduced her daily life to routine exposure. The gap between what she had been and what she now was widened not only in appearance, but in how others were permitted to talk about and act toward her. The revolutionary press amplified the images of decay and of moral rot attributed to the Queen. Writers who had once criticized the monarchy now penned invective aimed at a single figure who could be pinned for everything the old order had done wrong. The rhetoric hardened public appetite for display. Caricatures circulated with obscene jokes and false claims. Those fed into the attitudes of jailers who adopted mockery as routine. Within the prison, men assigned to watch her blurred the line between duty and cruelty. One guard made comments about her body. Another demanded explanations about her private routines. The guards' names appear in records. A young man who practiced mock compassion until it became mockery. Another who laughed when she failed to keep up with imposed hygiene. Voices that once deferred to a crown now used their proximity as power. The Queen's attempt to respond with composed statements was undermined by the physical condition that deprived her of clear memory and steady speech. Sleep deprivation and pain led to gaps in recall. These lapses were turned into evidence at later interrogations. The social mechanism at work was methodical. Degrade, then use the degradation as proof of guilt. In the early phase of escalated control, the state's agents began to separate children from their parents when they judged it necessary to re-educate the next generation. The Queen's youngest son was taken from his mother's arms in a raid meant to break attachment and to repurpose the child into a symbol of the new order. The child's name was Louis Charles, called by royalists with the style he would never fully hold. He was a boy of simple habits, frightened and confused. The taking of the child was not a private act. It was a public display of authority. The Queen resisted with the force she had left. She scratched, bit, shouted. She feared not only for his safety, but for the way his removal severed the last tether of ordinary family life. After the boy was forced away, the Queen's cries echoed in corridors where other prisoners heard and could not help. The child was given to a man named Antoine Simon, identified in records as a tradesman and a man of low repute, whom authorities used as an instrument of humiliation. Simon's task was clear: re-educate the child to teach him contempt for his parents and to force public confessions that delegitimized the monarchy. The method was systematic and cruel. Hunger, insults, forced performance, and the repeated inculcation of false narratives. The psychological violence of making a child denounce his mother and the public reading of such confessions violated the private sphere in a way that amplified the state's victory. Reports from those who later testified about these events describe a boy reduced to a shell. He learned obscene songs and crude phrases about his family. He was forced to participate in performances that mocked royal rituals. Those who observed Simon's custody of the child noted physical neglect and exposure to vulgar influences intended to distort his sense of self. The intent was not merely to punish the mother. It was to make the child into an instrument of propaganda. The image of a son denouncing his mother could be printed and displayed as incontrovertible proof for readers inclined to believe that the monarchy had bred corruption. In private, The queen learned of each new humiliation through second-hand reports and through interrogations that leveraged false confessions obtained under pressure. She was told her son had confessed to acts that were impossible for his age, and that he had been trained to accuse her of monstrous behaviors. These lies were convenient political tools. They did not need to be true. They only needed to be plausible enough to sway a public willing to accept the worst. The use of a child in this way deepened the cruelty, converting a family wound into state propaganda. The queen's health deteriorated visibly. Without consistent medical attention, what may have been a tumor or cervical cancer progressed unchecked. She experienced continuous bleeding and pain. The small rations of food and the constant cold undermined any recovery. She was required to perform the most private acts under observation. Guards watched her wash and dress. The humiliation was designed to eliminate any remnant of dignity. Staff records and later memoirs described the cramped cell where she was moved in the prison known as the Conciergerie. The room was below ground with damp permeating the stone and a persistent smell that could not be washed away. 2 guards were posted behind a screen at all times. The queen's clothing hung loose on her. She lost weight and slept poorly. In daylight hours, she tried to keep routine, reading, writing letters that would be intercepted, knitting when she could, but the tasks were less to pass time than to maintain a sense of self. When the bleeding would not stop, there was no real treatment. Cloths were changed infrequently, and the materials given were rough. Infections set in. She developed fever and weakness. Those charged with custody claimed they were following orders. Some claimed they felt uncomfortable but were doing their duty. The institutional defense for neglect was predictable and bureaucratic. The state had limited resources and must serve the general will. The moral accounting of what was permitted vanished in that calculus. Female prisoners and staff later described the constant commentary and jokes that accompanied her confinement. Men in positions of minor authority used her body as a subject of conversation. A young guard named Gilbert appears in personal accounts as someone who crossed the line from supervision to sexual harassment. He asked lewd questions and offered help with washing in exchange for favors. Another guard, Dufresne, is named as an accomplice in mockery. These men acted with impunity because their behavior was tolerated by superiors or because the system did not prioritize protecting someone stripped of rank. The queen's attempts to set boundaries were met with threats and indifference. Beyond the direct sexual harassment, there was a systematic effort to occupy her mind with rumors and lies about her children. She was told that her son was dead, that her daughter had been violated. Pamphlets mocking her circulated in public and were read aloud by men who aimed to humiliate her. The prison's design made privacy impossible. Every ordinary bodily function became a public scene. The sustained nature of these intrusions did not merely injure her physically. It pursued the deliberate aim of erasing any private identity remaining within her. The revolutionary justice apparatus prepared cases against prominent figures in quick succession. The queen's name appeared on the list for prosecution. The trials were short with evidence often drawn from rumor and coerced testimony. The system moved faster than any meaningful defense. When the queen finally faced the tribunal, she encountered prosecutors who had built careers on attacking aristocracy. The prosecutor who took a lead role in her case had published invective for years and now relished the chance to cross the threshold from pamphleteer to judge. The charges were manifold: conspiracy with foreign powers, misuse of state funds, and the most explosive allegation, incest. The incest charge relied on the boy's forced statements and on the willingness of some to conflate a mother's closeness with moral crime. Legal counsel for the queen was limited. Her defense sought to dispel the fabrications and to argue that claims made under duress and in a climate of fear were unreliable. Yet the tribunal operated under a different logic: speedy conclusion and exemplary punishment. In the courtroom, the queen was subject to public humiliation. The spectators filled the benches with varying motives. Some sought spectacle, others sought retribution. The judge's eyes measured not only the law, but the crowd. The penalty would not merely be punitive. It would be instructive. The queen attempted to present a calm account of her actions to rebut charges with specifics she remembered. But the months without sleep and with pain had left their mark on cognition. She faltered in dates and could not recall particulars with the precision demanded. The prosecutors seized on these lapses. They turned misplaced recollection into evidence of guilt. The boy's coerced statement read aloud produced a reaction in the room that blurred outrage with revulsion. Even among hardened revolutionaries, the nature of the accusation caused stomachs to turn. For a moment, sympathy flickered among some women present who began to weep. The queen appealed to that instinct. She asked women to consider whether any mother could commit such acts. The appeal produced a pause, but public and political forces closed ranks quickly. The tribunal's aim was not purely adjudicative. It was performative. A verdict would be a signal to other would-be defenders of the old order. The jury, pressured by the climate, deliberated briefly. Guilty verdicts were announced on a series of charges that together built a narrative. If one was guilty, all were proof of systemic intent. The sentence pronounced was death by the state instrument the revolution had adopted. The days before execution magnified the routines of humiliation. Her hair was cut roughly by the executioner. The act was not merely practical, but symbolic, to strip her of the last traces of status. Her registration as a condemned person reduced her history to a file entry, a list of charges, and an execution date. Authorities arranged the physical details with a mixture of professional efficiency and deliberate cruelty. She was given a thin white dress to wear, the costume of the condemned, and told that she would be transported through public streets to the execution site. The preparations were intended to display the power of the state over the most visible symbols of the old hierarchy. Men who had once been servants of court protocol now supervised the execution of ceremony in its reversed form. The queen wrote letters in the small hours to family and to a sister who had remained loyal. She tried to preserve her voice on paper where it could not be intercepted in the same way. Some of those letters were seized, others saved by sympathetic hands. The condemned woman ate little. The final meals were offered more for form than for nourishment. The nights were long, and the guards remained alert to any sign of rebellion among other prisoners. The public appetite for spectacle meant that the procession route was monitored to manage crowd behavior. The state wanted the execution to be seen as lawful and serene, not as chaotic revenge. The carriage that would carry her to the square was not gilded. It was a plain cart, a visual statement that the old regime had no more right to ceremony. The route was packed with onlookers who hurled insults and slurs. Food vendors worked the crowds, treating the event as another market day. Some spectators came with political fervor. Others came out of curiosity. For the condemned, the journey offered a final brutal catalog of places once familiar. The palace facades, the river banks, the streets where she had once passed in triumph. Each landmark now marked loss. When the cart finally reached the execution site, the platform and blade were arranged with the same clinical precision of many such public deaths. The executioner performed his task with practiced hands, the neck bared, the strap secured. Her last words were an apology to the executioner for stepping on his foot, a small remnant of the manners instilled by a lifetime in court. The blade fell with a sound recorded as a dull, definitive end. The body was carried away and buried among many in a common pit. The state had completed its public act. The revolutionary calendar recorded another point of closure, even as private grief and historical debate continued. After the execution, the physical remains were treated without ceremony. The burial in a common grave was intentional to prevent a focus of veneration and to underscore the leveling promise of the revolution. For years, the exact location remained vague. The bones of those executed were mixed with other remains. It was only decades later, after restoration of the monarchy, that efforts were made to locate the remains of the former rulers. The search was imperfect and controversial. Pieces believed to belong to the royal couple were identified by their relative size and by circumstantial markers, then reinterred with ritual in the royal basilica. Critics have debated the certainty of those identifications, but the political act of reclaiming remains was itself a statement. Bodies could be reassigned significance by later governments. For the family, the dead would be gathered not by the public who had cheered, but by those who wished to restore memory and honor. The burial and reburial of remains shows how history negotiates physical traces with political meaning. Bones could not undo the months of humiliation, nor could ritual replace the private moments lost in the years before capture. Memory moved in different registers: public record, family testimony, and the slow recovery of documents that had been suppressed or destroyed. The surviving daughter endured exile and a life that preserved constant memory of the family's end. She wrote accounts and memoirs with the clarity of someone trying to fix a narrative that had been distorted by propaganda. Her testimony became important for historians, offering details about the household's final months, about the personal care that was withheld, and about the specific abuses. She never forgave the state that had executed her kin and that had permitted the humiliation of the living. Yet even her writings show the limits of personal reconstruction. Memory is precise in some particulars and fogged in others. She remembered certain gestures, the texture of a shawl, the cadence of a child's laugh, but her account also carried the imprint of decades of grief and a political stance aimed at vindication. Public opinion shifted over time. What had been hysteria and celebration in one year became in another source material for remorse and debate. The daughter's life illustrates how the human subjects of historical events live on after their public function has ended, carrying the private burdens that the public has rewritten. The men who had orchestrated the prosecutions and who had inflamed public sentiment did not all survive the revolution they helped lead. Internal purges and shifting alliances claimed many architects of the terror. The prosecutor who had led the charge against the Queen was himself later swept into the system of accusation. The fall of prominent revolutionaries underscores a central irony. A movement that justified itself through purges and exemplary punishments turned on its own. Some of those who had advocated for the greatest penalties found themselves judged by the same instruments. Violence replicated itself within the structures the revolution had built. This cycle of accusation and execution points to a structural dynamic. When a political project grounds itself in the removal of enemies without consistent legal safeguards, the categories of enemy can expand until membership in them is arbitrary. The Queen's fate fits within that wider argument. She was a visible target, and her public destruction served rhetorical and political objectives, but the machinery set in motion did not remain contained. It expanded back on those who had believed themselves protected by its logic. The later fate of many prominent revolutionaries, including Robespierre, was to be executed in turn. Their trials mirrored earlier ones in procedural haste and rhetorical flourish. The same public crowds that had demanded punitive spectacle sometimes turned away or turned against the instigators as fear and exhaustion spread. Those who once cheered found that revolutionary justice had no secure place to stop. Historians have traced how ideological certainty and the need for enemies produced a culture that consumed its own leaders. The Queen's death became one episode in that history, a dramatic display that magnified the state's claim while also demonstrating the reversibility of such power. The revolution achieved many structural changes. It also produced cycles of retribution that later generations would interpret as tragic excess. Her story remained useful for different sides. For monarchists as proof of revolutionary cruelty, for Republicans as evidence of necessary rupture, and for historians as a case that resists simple moralization. The use of propaganda in the month before trial was deliberate and granular. Pamphlets, plays, and songs painted gross caricatures of the Queen. Printmakers and writers recycled rumors into printed evidence. The aim was to create an image so repulsive it would justify the most severe responses. The allegations about her sexual behavior, ownership of illicit correspondence, and involvement in treason were amplified and repeated until repetition itself seemed like corroboration. Revolutionary authorities relied on a population hungry for symbols and simplified narratives. The information ecology of a revolutionary city favored the loudest voice and the most sensational claim. Rumor traveled quickly. Truth required corroboration that the court did not want to wait for. The Queen's personal letters were sometimes published selectively to imply intent. Other documents were altered or presented without context. In this environment, the line between fact and fiction blurred. The prosecution used this environment strategically. The legal proceedings did not merely apply evidence. They molded public perception by timing revelations to coincide with trials and executions. The state used spectacle as law and law as spectacle. For those who watched from inside the prison, the printed world had direct consequences. Guards read pamphlets aloud in courtyards. Street slogans entered cells. A legal claim in a paper might become the justification for a new indignity in prison. The Queen's responses, written with shaky hand and limited resources, rarely reached the same audience. Her defense was private and legal. The prosecution was public and performative. This imbalance shaped outcomes. Even those who might have been inclined to sympathy found their judgments sullied by months of saturated negative representations. The state's public message dominated the moral imagination. The tactic was effective because it relied on social instincts. When a community hears the same assertion repeatedly, individual skepticism is eroded. The revolutionaries knew this. They manipulated the channels of information the same way they manipulated institutions, turning social energy towards specific ends. The result for the queen was that her personal truth was drowned in a chorus of accusation and mockery. The accusation that resonated most painfully was the forced statement attributed to the child. This testimony had been obtained under conditions of coercion and manipulation. Individuals who witnessed the process later testified that the boy had been coached, starved, and taunted until he repeated words placed in his mouth. The legal culture of the time struggled with the weight of such testimony because courts were structured to accept oral statements as powerful evidence. The revolutionary tribunal exploited that tendency. The presentation of the child's statement in court functioned not merely as evidence, but as a moral condemnation that justified the final sentence.